the first fourth tone only goes about halfway down. The second fourth tone starts a little bit lower than the first fourth does, and then it goes all the way down. So the first one goes only about halfway down. The second one starts just a bit lower than the first one does, and it goes all the way down.
重要
What's up, guys? This is John from Outlier, and in this video, we're going to talk about how tones interact with each other in Chinese. We're going to cover the big rules that everyone knows, like when you have two third tones in a row, the first one changes to second tone. But then I'm going to talk about some smaller tone changes that happen with all of the other two-tone combinations. Changes that aren't usually taught, but are super important if you want to have clear pronunciation in Mandarin. Now, it's one thing to know about these rules, but it's another thing to incorporate them into your own accent. So I also want to give you some more in-depth techniques on how to fix all of your two-tone combos for free. Just click the link in the description to get a free training video and pack of audio files to help you fix your tone combos. Okay, on to the video. So most of us, when we first start learning Chinese, we learn, the four tones, and then you learn if you have two third tone syllables that show up next to each other, the first one turns to second tone. And you probably learn, for example, 不 meaning not. When it shows up before a fourth tone word, it becomes second tone, right? So these are the big tone changes that, most people learn when they're first starting to learn Chinese. But there's a lot of other, they're not tone changes per se, because it still remains the same tone. But the way that each tone is rendered by native speakers in real life can, change based on what comes before it and what comes after it, even based on the speaker's emotions and the words that they want to stress. There's a lot of things that go into it. So today I wanted to talk about all the different ways that tones interact with each other and how that affects how they get realized in everyday life, in real situations by native speakers. So when you first start learning Chinese, usually, like I said, you learn the four tones and you learn them in isolation. You hear ma, 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 right? We've all done that. It may not have been that syllable, but you learn that 1, 2, 3, 4, ma, 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 ma. You probably had a graph, something like this in your textbook. Or, maybe you were told about pitch heights 1 through 5, right? Where 5 is the high end of your speaking voice range and 1 is the low end. So they'll say like a first tone, they call it 5, 5 because it starts at 5 and it ends at 5. Like ma, right? Or second tone, they'll call it a 3, 5 because it starts somewhere in the middle and rises up. Ma. But then usually after, whether you have this graph or you get the, the pitch numbers or whatever it is, after that, basically you get left to your own devices. Of course, this is a huge problem because you haven't mastered tones just because you know those four canonical tones, which is what I'll call them. I'll talk about that in a minute. You haven't mastered the tones just because you know that and you know a couple of tone change rules. So this is a huge problem for most learners, is that even if they know the four tones in isolation, they don't necessarily know how to pronounce them in context and how to recognize them when they hear them. So those four tones, like I said, are called the four canonical tones. And what that means is that that's how they're pronounced in isolation with zero context. In other words, the four canonical tones is just an abstraction. It's not representative of how people really talk in everyday life, right? It's sort of taking the idea that, a tone 1 should be high and level and abstracting that to say like, oh, it should be, at a level 5. But if you say every first tone at exactly the same pitch, you're going to sound really weird because that's not what happens in real life. So what I want to talk about today is how tones change in context. And there's three categories we're going to look at. We're going to look at big tone changes, which are the, when the tone actually changes to a different tone, like I mentioned earlier. We're going to look at little tone changes, which is, when it still remains the same tone, but the way that tone is rendered in actual speech may be altered a little bit. And you'll see what I mean when we get to that. And the third category, we're not going to really be able to address in detail because it's, how things like emotion or sentence level stress, which words the speaker is choosing to emphasize, how things like that can affect the way that tones are actually pronounced in real life. But I will give some tips for how to go about learning that. Okay, so big tone changes. The first one we're going to look at is this character, E. Now that's its dictionary tone, its canonical tone is the first tone, E. But you'll find that usually it's not pronounced in the first tone in regular speech. When it shows up before a fourth tone, it actually changes to second tone. So you wouldn't say E yang, but you'd say E yang, right? So the E changes from first tone to second tone, yang. Now, before any other tone, it becomes a fourth tone. So in front of a first tone like this, you wouldn't say yi tian, you'd say yi tian. Before a second tone, like in this word, yi nian, you can hear it becomes fourth tone, yi nian, that the tone of E falls, right? So if you say yi nian, it's going to sound incorrect to a native speaker. And then in front of a third tone, it's the same. It becomes fourth tone. Yi qi, yi qi. If you say yi qi, it's not going to sound right. And, people may misunderstand you. Okay, there are some exceptions to this. When E shows up as part of a series of numbers, like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, right? In those cases, it's pronounced in its normal dictionary tone, the first tone. When it's pronounced as part of a larger number, like 8点14, it also remains first tone. Or if it's part of an address or a date, basically whenever it's used as a number. So for this date, you'd say 2011年, and notice that both of those are in the first tone, 2011年, right? So basically when it's being used as a number and not as part of a word is a good way to think of it. It'll be the first tone. In any other situation, you need to follow those tone change rules. Okay, the second big tone change rule we have is 不. Now, as I mentioned earlier, before a fourth tone, it becomes second tone, like 不对 or 不是, right? Now, fortunately, the rules for 不 are much simpler than they are for 一. And there's no exceptions. There's just this one rule and no exceptions. The third big tone change category we want to look at is the third tone. Now, as I said earlier, we've all learned, when you have two third tones in a row, the first one changes to second tone. That's, most people learn that in the first week or so of learning Chinese. Something that isn't taught very much is the half third tone. So when we learn those canonical tones, usually we learn something like ma, where it dips down, then it rises back up, right? But the third tone is very rarely pronounced like that in real life. Really, you would only pronounce it that way if you really wanted to emphasize that particular syllable, or if it maybe came at the end of a sentence. Any other time, it's going to be pronounced as what we call the half third tone. So the half third tone is where it just dips down and doesn't rise back up. You can also really think of it as just a low tone, because that's how most people pronounce it in real life. It's just a low flat tone, or it might dip a little bit. And we'll actually see a few examples of that when we get into the small tone changes too. Okay, so that's actually a good segue into small tone changes. So what we're going to do when we talk about the small tone changes, now again, this is not where the tone becomes a different tone, but where it that canonical tone contour actually changes a bit in context. So what we're going to do is we're going to look at pairs of tones. So we're going to look at each combination. First tone, second tone, a 1-2. We're going to look at a 1-1, 1-2, 1-3, 1-4, 2-1, 2-2, 2-3, 2-4, and so on, right? So we're going to go through each one. We're going to listen to a recording of a specific word that has that two-tone combination. And then I'm going to draw specific attention to some of the changes that you should notice and that you should practice, picking out in speech, and also practice, pronouncing it that way yourself. You'll sound a whole lot more natural if you can do this. All right, so we're going to start with 1-1 combination. That is a word where both syllables are first tone. And then we're going to go through the rest of them progressively. And with each one, I'm going to point out, some small details that you should notice because these are things that you should adopt into your own pronunciation. So what I recommend doing, and I'll provide recordings for these too that you can, download and practice. But with each one, pay attention to how you would have thought it was said, and then also pay attention to how the native speaker differs from you. And I recommend practicing these until they become a part of your speech, until it happens automatically. And it's also good to keep these words in mind as a reference. So once you've listened to, say, a specific word a bunch of times and you know exactly how it sounds, then if you're pronouncing another word and you're not sure you quite got it right, you can think back to how your reference word sounds and, pronounce the word that you're unsure of in a similar way as far as the tones go. So that sort of thing can really help as you're trying to incorporate these small tone differences into your own speech. Okay, so let's listen to a 1-1 combination.
飞机
All right, so notice that the second syllable, even though it's still first tone, it's very slightly lower. Listen again.
飞机飞机
And this is also true with sentences. As a sentence goes along, the first tones will generally progressively get lower. That's because as we go through a sentence in speaking, our voices tend to get lower in pitch because we have less air pressure holding that pitch up. So we tend to, even in English, we tend to talk down towards the end of the sentences, just like I'm doing here. Okay, let's listen to a 1-2 combination.
安排安排
Okay, notice that even at its highest point, the second tone never gets as high as the first tone. Listen again.
安排安排
Okay, here's a 1-3 combo.
辛苦
You should notice it had the half third tone. They didn't pronounce the full falling and rising type contour.
辛苦辛苦
Okay, here's a 1-4.
车票车票
Okay, notice that the fourth tone actually starts off higher than the first tone. So when you're pronouncing a 1-4 combination, make sure that when you start the fourth tone syllable, that your voice rises a little bit. Make sure you get all the way up there, or else it's going to sound weird.
车票车票
Okay, here is a 2-1 combination.
皮肤皮肤
Now, just like in the 1-2 combination, notice that the second tone doesn't get up to the height of the first. There's a bit of a gap between the end of the second and the beginning of the first. And I mean a gap in pitch, not a gap in time.
皮肤皮肤
Okay, here's a 2-2.
来源来源
All right, so notice that the entire second syllable is a little bit lower. That is, it starts lower than the first syllable starts, and it ends lower than the first syllable ends. Listen again.
来源来源
So when you have a 2-2 combination, make sure that your second syllable is just slightly lower than the first one. Okay, here's a 2-3.
牙齿，牙齿，
All right, notice that the second tone starts higher than the third tone does. If they overlap too much, you risk it sounding like 2-4 because of the half-third tone. Remember earlier I said the half-third falls but doesn't rise. So if they overlap, it's going to sound confusing.
牙齿，
Okay, here's a 2-4 so you can compare.
节日，节日，
So you'll notice that the fourth tone starts considerably higher than where the second tone ends. I'll slow that down so you can hear it again.
节日，
Okay, here's a 3-1 combination.
普通，普通，
Again, we have that half-third tone.
普通，
Another thing to keep in mind with a 3-1 combination is that it's a good indicator of where the bottom and top of your tonal range should be. Now, when I was trying to learn a more Taiwanese accent, I was told that I should use like when somebody asks you a question and you can't be bothered to say yes, so you just say and if you use that, word we have in English, that basically corresponds to the third tone and first tone in Taiwanese Mandarin. The people in Taiwan just tend to speak with a really narrow tonal range. And so the first tones are actually not all that high in their range. It's a comfortable middle level. Whereas if you listen to somebody from the north of China, like Beijing, for example, their tonal range is going to be much wider. Their first tones are going to be fairly high in their speaking range, and the third tones, just like in Taiwan, are going to be low. So you need to choose who you imitate based on, what you want to sound like. Okay, let's listen to that 3-1 again.
普通，普通，
Okay, here's a 3-2 combination.
可能，可能，
Notice that the second tone starts higher than the end of the third tone. So after you pronounce that half third, you need to come up a little bit for the beginning of the second.
可能，可能，
All right, here's a 3-3.
水果，水果，
Now, this shouldn't be surprising, as we talked about earlier. When 2 third tones show up in a row, the first one becomes a second tone. So it's the same exact contour as 2-3.
水果，水果，
All right, so here is a 3-4 combination.
广告，广告，
Again, you'll notice there's the half third tone.
广告，
Another thing to keep in mind is that you need to make sure that you get high enough for the beginning of the fourth tone. It should be considerably higher than the third tone.
广告，广告，
Okay, here's a 4-1 combo.
菜单，菜单，
All right, the important thing to notice here is that the fourth tone doesn't go all the way down. It only goes about halfway, and we're going to see that with the other combinations too.
菜单，
Another thing to notice is that just like in the 1-4 combination we listened to earlier, in the 4-1 combination, the fourth tone starts higher than the first tone is. So make sure that, the top of your fourth tone and the level of your first tone aren't the same. They shouldn't be the same. The fourth tone should start a little bit higher than the level of your first tone.
菜单，菜单，
Okay, here's a 4-2 combination.
幸福，幸福，
Again, the fourth tone doesn't go all the way down. Notice also that the second tone starts a little lower than where the fourth tone ends. I'll slow it down so you can hear it again.
幸福，
Okay, here's a 4-3 combination.
重点，重点，
All right, here we see that the fourth tone actually does go pretty much all the way down. However, notice that the second syllable, that third tone, still starts lower than the end of the fourth tone.
重点，重点，
Also notice that, again, we're hearing the half third tone here, not the full contour.
重点
Okay, now here's a 4-4 combination.
重要重要
All right, the first thing to notice here is that the first fourth tone only goes about halfway down, like we saw with 4-1 and 4-2. The second fourth tone starts a little bit lower than the first fourth does, and then it goes all the way down. So the first one goes only about halfway down. The second one starts just a bit lower than the first one does, and it goes all the way down, just like the full normal canonical contour.
重要
Okay, so that does it for the big changes and the small changes. The third category I wanted to talk about, like I said, is changes caused by things like sentence level intonation, stress, that is, which words are being stressed by the speaker, emotion, etc. Now, emotion is a big one. Obviously, when you're angry, you're going to talk differently from when you're just, being normal. And that, it affects tones just like it affects anything else. So how do you learn that? I remember once, I don't even remember what I was angry about, but I remember the embarrassment of being angry and not even being able to express myself in Chinese when I was living in Taiwan. It's because the anger gets in the way of your ability to, to express yourself when you're speaking a foreign language. It does a little bit in your native language too, but you've had a lot more practice being angry in your native language, right? So how do you get to the point where your emotions don't affect you as much, where you can still speak even, through whatever emotion that you may be experiencing? And the answer is practice. Just like I said, you've had a lot of practice in your native language. You need to also practice it in your target language. So, it helps to practice being angry, practice being sad, practice imitating actors in situations where they are expressing emotions, and try to talk the way that they talk, right? It sounds weird to say practice being angry, but just think of it like acting. That's really what it is. You're doing it in, at home, in the safety of your own, wherever it is that you study, so that when you encounter a situation like that in real life, you have some experience with it at least. So yeah, it's like acting. You can even take a scene from a movie or a TV show and copy the way the actors talk. It's a super useful exercise. I highly recommend it. Unfortunately, I can't teach you all the different ways that things like emotion and sentence level stress and things like that affect tonal contours. But what I can say is, go out there and listen and pay close attention, and imitate. If you've taken our pronunciation and accent masterclass, you know that the entire third unit is about, techniques for how to imitate the way native speakers talk and how to adopt that into your own accent. Well, it's the same for, expressing yourself when you're angry or when you're sad or whatever the emotion is, or, how to emphasize certain words in a sentence. It's all about intensive listening and imitation. So you go out and find some scenes that have the actors talking the way that you want to be able to talk, and practice it, and then eventually that will start coming out in real life when you're talking and you face similar situations. So that covers it. And please check out the link in the description where I give you some more intensive training on tone pairs. It's totally free and it's super effective. All right, I'm John from Outlier. See you next time.